G'day to you, friends. Welcome back, and thank you for joining us for part two of the story of the clever wife. When we left off, the strong son of Miller Smith had just married the clever daughter of the neighboring shepherd. They had had their ceremony, they had had their wedding night, and now they were enjoying their first breakfast together as husband and wife. And as they enjoyed their meal, it seemed like every family in their valley came by with some sort of gift for the lovely couple, a wee blessing, if you will, for them for when they established their own house. And for Miller Smith, that was the most important thing to him now. As a builder, he wanted to build a home for his son and his lovely daughter-in-law to live in as a couple. But plans can change and life is funny. And that afternoon, they received a message from the great king in the southern part of their lands, asking Miller Smith to come with his skills and with his tools to build a new castle for the southern kingdom, a castle better than anyone had ever seen before. Well, over the next few days, all the plans were made, and Miller Smith and his son loaded up all their tools onto the wagon, and they did the planning that they needed around the household and took care of the chores, and everything was ready. And on the chosen morning, the strong son kissed his clever wife goodbye, mounted up into the wagon, and they set off towards the southern kingdom, knowing that it would be that day and part of the next before they arrived there with their slowly plodding wagon along the road. They weren't more than about 20 minutes down the road along their way when Miller Smith turned to his son and he said, "Lad, is there anything you can do to shorten the road?" The son said, "Father, I can't shorten a road. A road is a road. What can I do to shorten a road?" And Miller Smith shook his head and he says, "No, lad, you're not hearing me. Is there anything you can do to make the trip seem to go by quicker?" "Well, no, Father. I mean, a trip is a trip. A road is a road. I don't know what you're asking for." And Miller Smith said, "Well, lad, if you can't make this trip go by quicker for me, you're really no use to me at all." And he gave him a little nudge and told him to get out of the wagon and go home. And the son stood there at the side of the road, watching his father roll on to the south. And then he turned his face back to home and ran as quickly as he could. And he got home within a short period of time. He got home to his clever wife. And when she saw him coming into the yard, she said, "What's wrong? Why are you home? Where's your father?" And he says, "Father's fine and all is fine, except that he kicked me out of the wagon." "Oh, why would he do something like that?" And when he told his wife what had happened, she said, "You're such a silly lad. Don't you know that just sharing a story with your father would have made the trip seem shorter? A wee tale would have seemed to take miles off the road." And the son thought for a moment and said, "Of course, but I'm no storyteller. I don't know how to do that." And she said, "Set you down and I'll give you a tale." And she drew him a mug of ale and sat down with him and gave him the outline of a fine story and said, "When you're telling it to your father, add whatever silly details you like. Just stretch the story out and have fun with you. He just wants a bit of entertainment." Well, the lad thought that was a good idea, and he finished his ale and kissed his wife, and out the door he went, and he ran on down the road to the south, and he caught up with his father just about noontime. And without saying a word, he hopped up into the wagon and started sharing the tale that his wife had shared with him, and didn't finish the story until the sun was beginning to set. And they stopped at the side of the road, and they slept rough under the trees for the one night, arriving at the home of the Southern King the next day, shortly before noon. Well, all the plans were laid and the designs were agreed to, and the work started, and the stone was being squared, and the timber was being harvested, and everything was being made ready. This project was going to take a long time. In fact, it was almost a year before they approached the finishing of this magnificent new castle for the Southern King. And when everything was almost done, the king, with his guard and his retinue and his entourage and his sons, all came to visit the site and visit Miller Smith to gain a report on the castle. Miller Smith explained that they were almost done. There was just one ceiling left to finish in the great hall, and when that was done, the job would be complete and the castle would be ready. And the king said, "I'll be back tomorrow to see how you're progressing again. I'm very anxious to take possession of my castle. You've done lovely work, Miller Smith. I will see you on the morrow." And away he went. Well, after the king and his retinue and entourage and guards and all of the sons, the princes, had left, the woman that had been hired to manage the site, to feed the workers and to take care of things, came up to Miller Smith and said, "You don't know our king like I do. He has plans for you and your son." And Miller Smith thought, there's more building to do? And he said, "No. The king's desire is that no one will ever have a castle finer than this one that you are building for him. When the castle is done, My king intends on throwing you and your strong son into the dungeon, and you will never see the light of day. Well, Miller Smith couldn't leave. He had spent a year on the project. He had to get paid. He couldn't run and leave behind his tools. He had to figure out some way. And he told his son, "Fear not, on the morrow when we meet the king, all will be well." Well, the next day the king came back and he asked Miller Smith, "Is the castle prepared now for me to move in?" And Miller Smith said to the king, "There is one more detail that I need, but sadly, your majesty, there's a special tool that I need that I, in my forgetfulness, left at home. I have to go home to get it." And the king said, No, it's quite all right. You keep working. I will send one of my servants on a fast horse." And Miller Smith said, "Oh, your majesty, this is a very special, delicate tool. I don't trust a simple servant to pick this up." And the king thought, "What about one of my sons? I could send one of the princes. They've been raised to be gentlemen." And it was agreed that the crown prince, the heir to the southern kingdom, would go as a special messenger on his fastest horse, ride north to the home of Miller Smith and gain this tool. Miller Smith said, "Let me write a letter for your son to carry to my daughter-in-law, and all will be well." And he sat down with parchment and pen and scratched out a letter to the daughter-in-law, folded it up, gave it to the prince, and taking his fastest horse, the prince was away that very moment, arriving at Miller Smith's home shortly after noontime. Well, he came into the gate, and one of the servants ran and took the horse, and the prince came to the door, and of course the clever wife came out and greeted the prince and asked, why he was there, and he explained that her father-in-law, Miller Smith, needed a particularly special tool to finish the job, and they would be home in just a few days. And in giving the letter, she opened the letter up and read it, her brow furrowed, but then she smiled and nodded her head. For what the letter said was, "Dearest daughter, to complete this task, I need my special set of silver sequins, which you will find in the deep oaken chest in the back corner of the barn. Please give these silver sequins to the prince. Do not let him return without them. Signed, your father, Miller Smith." Well, the clever wife knew there was no such tool as sequins, silver or otherwise, and she understood immediately that something was amiss. But she acted as all was well. She invited the prince to join her, saying that she would need his help to access the chest. And into the barn they went, and into the far back corner of the barn, in the deepest, darkest corner of the barn, there was indeed a large oaken chest with a heavy lock on it. And as mistress of the house, she took her keys and she undid the lock, opened the lock, and turned to the prince and said, "I will need your help opening this lid. It's so heavy, your highness." And the prince helped her lift up the heavy lid to the chest. And as she braced it, she said, "In the far corner, you will see a bundle of rags, and wrapped in those rags is the special set of silver sequins that my dear father needs to finish your father's castle. Could you please reach in?" And the prince bent over the edge, and he reached and he stretched and he stretched, but it was a very deep, tall cabinet. And as he continued to stretch, the clever wife reached down and, catching him about the ankles, flipped him head over heels into the chest, slammed the lid down, and set the lock. Going to a counter, she grabbed one of her father-in-law's wood augers. She bored a hole in the heavy oaken chest, and speaking through the hole, she told the prince, "I know exactly what your father is up to. There is no such thing as sequins for a tool. I will hand you parchment and pen, and you will write a letter to your father demanding the release of my husband and father-in-law, or you will never see the light of day." While she pressed through the parchment and the pen, and the crown prince wrote the letter to his father, and a messenger was taken to send the letter down to the king of the south. And upon receiving it, he realized that his plans had been foiled, and he had no choice but to complete the process of his castle and the payment to Miller Smith if he ever hoped to see his son again. The project was done, the castle was ready, the coin was given to Miller Smith with an apology from the king. Miller Smith and his strong son mounted their wagon and made their way home, not stopping until they were in their own yard, upon which time they opened the chest and allowed the crown prince to mount his horse and ride for home. The king of the south had a ruined reputation, for everyone knew what he had planned to do to Miller Smith and his son. But more importantly, Miller Smith and his son were now home, reunited with the clever wife that had saved their life in more ways than one. And when their tension passed and the day eased, Miller Smith turned to his son and said, "Your clever wife will be the saving of us if anyone ever will. I think you should build her a castle even finer than what we have just done for the Southern King." And over the coming year, Miller Smith and his son and all their friends from the valley did that very thing. They built the finest castle that anyone had ever seen, and moving in the strong son and clever wife with their extended families into the castle, great joy and renown went across the land, and Miller Smith and his strong son and the clever wife all lived happily ever after.